Okay, then let's go for the last session on initial access. And hopefully you digested some of the control signal stuff during the coffee break, so you're not in shock. We're talking about CORESET, PCI format and push format. So cell search and random access. That part, and cell search, that's the process of finding a new cell to camp upon or to access, and also to get the system information. You need to know how that cell is configured and so on. And in NR we do that based on something we call the SSB, synchronization sequence block. So it's what you see here on the figure. It's a primary synchronization sequence, it's a secondary synchronization sequence, and then a physical broadcast channel with some system information. And these white parts here, they are unused. So even it's 240 subcarriers in frequency domain, we just use 127 of them for PSS, and these regions are unused. And I think, I mean, synchronization signals and system information you have in I dare to say any system, even if they may be called differently. But if you compare with LT, there are a couple of differences. LT also has PSS, SSS, and PBCH, even though we don't call it SSB in that case. But there are a number of things that have changed in NR. One is that we have the less frequent transmission of these signals to make it more ultra-lean. We do support beamforming that we didn't do in LT. And we can actually also get some more system information more on demand. So that's another new ultra-lean type of feature. So this is this structure of it. It's 4 of them symbols in time and 240 subcarriers in frequency domain. And the subcarrier spacing and so on, that depends on the frequency band we're running in and the numerology. So if you're in the lower frequency range here, below 3 gigahertz or up to 6 or so, this is the bandwidth it occupies. And if you're up in the millimeter wave range, you see it's a little bit wider here, but it's less of concern since we have plenty of bandwidth at those deployments. And the phone, of course, knows which frequency bands it's searching for channels, so then it knows which SSB structure to apply in terms of subcarrier spacing and so on. And one thing that is different compared to LT is that the SSB is not necessarily at the center of the carrier. In LT, all the sync signals were always in the center. That's not the case here, which may look a little bit strange. Why do you have the light blue carrier with an SSB out in one edge? And the reason for that has to do with this sparse transmission in the frequency domain. Because a carrier can be anywhere on the raster, on the frequency raster. And that raster is quite granular. I think in LT it was 15 kilohertz apart, these ticks. I think in NR it could be all the way down to 5 kilohertz in some cases, depending on which frequency band you're looking at. But it is relatively dense. And if you have an NR device that has to look for SSBs on many bands, not only the bands covered by LT, but also all the millimeter wave bands, there's quite a number of frequencies where the carrier might be located. And then we also said that the SSB is transmitted less often than in LT. So that in combination would of course mean that if I had to search a large number of frequency points, and it's very seldom that I get an SSB, then it would take a very long time to find a new carrier. So that's why in NR we took an approach of defining not just the frequency raster, which is more of a regulatory thing where the carrier may be located, but also search raster, which is where the SSB can be located in a frequency domain. And as you see here in the figure, that is much sparser. I don't remember the numbers now, but it could be hundreds of kilohertz apart. So it's more sparse in time, which increases the search time, but also more sparse in frequency, which decreases the search time. And the combination in total, it's on par with LTE. And since this search raster is relatively sparse, it means that the SSB could be out in the edge here, there, or there. It can't be in the middle because there's no search raster point there. And then we have the beam sweeping when it comes to beam forming and the cell search. In LTE, the sync signal is transmitted once every 5 milliseconds. It could be once every 5 milliseconds. In NR, we extended that to 20 milliseconds to get more to be in line with ultra-lean design. I mean, from a network perspective, you will probably want to stretch out that time even further to block less resources and be more energy efficient and so on. But from a UV time, you probably would like to have it more often because that would speed up the search process and make it simpler. So 20 milliseconds was a good compromise in the default setting. So we have what's known as the SS burst period as default 20 milliseconds. You can actually configure it to even longer time periods. So you can set it to 100 milliseconds or something. But that would only make sense if you do some carrier aggregation and you have found one carrier and then you're searching for another carrier and you know that it's a sparser in time. So a UV that doesn't know anything would assume 20 milliseconds. So that is what all carriers you want to be able to use for initial access need to have. And then every 20 milliseconds, you transmit one of these SS burst sets, which is number of SSBs in different directions. Can be up to 5 milliseconds in length, depending on how many beams you have. Then you scan through the beams like this, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And 20 milliseconds later, you scan through all the beams again, 1, 2, 3. And what in the specification is said that the number of SS blocks per SS burst set depends on the frequency range. So in practice, this will be the maximum number of beams or beam directions that you can use for initial access in the different frequency ranges. You see in the lower bands, it's a relatively small number because you don't need to do that much beam forming, especially not for link budget reasons, initial access. So maybe you can just do with one beam here. But if you're up and running in the millimeter wave range, the link budget is much tougher, and then you need to have more narrow beams to focus the energy, and then you need more beam directions to be able to sweep through your area. So every 20 milliseconds you can sweep through, or the UV assumes that you sweep through up to this number of beam directions.
So if you have here two numbers, 5 milliseconds and 20 milliseconds. Is it now so that this one SS burst set of 64 beams is gone through in 5 milliseconds, and then you are 50 milliseconds silent?
Yes. So if you have used all your beams, then it will be up to 5 milliseconds. You can use a small number of beams, then it might be done a little bit earlier. I mean, if you just use one beam, then of course you're done after one.
But they are back to back. Immediately you send one, then next, then next, then next, then you are silent after that.
Oh, yeah, almost back to back. There's like an OTM symbol in between here. But they come pretty quickly in sequence, and then you're silent, and then they come again in sequence. That's the idea. This is what an SSB could look like. In this case, I assume 15 kilohertz subcarrier spacing. Then I can fit in 2 SSBs into 1 millisecond slot. Up to 4 slots, I can have up to 8 SSBs. I think that's what we have here on the table at most 15 kilohertz. So then I can have up to 8 SSBs, and as you see, they're almost back to back. This would be 4 slots, so it would be done after 4 milliseconds actually. And then I'm silent, and 20 milliseconds later, I start the same thing again. So that's why I can do it. And then, of course, if I have a site with just a sector antenna and no beamforming, then I just need one SSB, and then I don't need anything more. So then I will probably do this one and skip the rest. So that's a new thing in NR, that you can beamform and beam sweep this SSB, so sync signals. Then if you remember the SSB, it consisted of the primary sync sequence, secondary sync sequence, and the PBCH, the system information. So we will take a look at these three things one by one. Let's start by the PSS. So the PSS, it could be one of three different length 127 M sequences. It uses these subcarriers in the middle, and as you remember, there was 214 in total, so some empty subcarriers on the edges here. So we just generate one out of these three sequences across here. And what the U can do when you turn it on, it starts by looking for PSS. So it tries blindly all possible timings, these three sequences on all possible OFDM symbol timings. It doesn't know where the OFDM symbol starts, so it basically just correlates the received signal and until it finds a correlation peak. Then it knows, okay, here is probably an OFDM symbol with the PSS. So then it has found the OFDM symbol timing. And the reason for having some empty subcarriers here on the edges, I mean, one could ask, why didn't we make a longer sequence or a more narrow SSB? That has to do with the fact that we have a frequency error at cold start. So the handset is not spot on the carrier frequency. It could be drifting a little bit oscillator. So we need a little bit of a guard on the sides here to be on the safe side. So that's the first thing the UV does when you turn it on. It does a continuous correlation with these three PSS sequences and tries to find one of them. And when it's found one PSS sequence, then it knows the OFDM symbol timing. When it does the next thing, then you know the OFDM symbol timing, and then you know that the SSS is 2 OFDM symbols later, not the next one, but next one. So then you know that the PSS repeats every 20 milliseconds, and you know 2 OFDM symbols later comes the SSS. And the SSS is also length 127 sequence, it's a gold sequence, and it can be 336 different sequences. So then the UE does correlation with all these 336 different SSS possibilities. And when it has found a correlation peak there for the SSS, then it's know which of these sequences it is. And this SSS correlation is simple because then you know the OFDM symbol timings. You just need to correlate with the different sequences. For the PSS case, you didn't know the timing, so then you just have 3 sequences because the PSS step is quite complex. So now after the PSS and SSS, then you know which PSS sequence, 1 out of 3, and you know which SSS sequence, 1 out of 336. And that they together form the physical layer cell ID. So you can have 1008 different cell IDs in NR. So now you know the cell ID, you know the timing of the PSS or SS, you know where the SSB is located. Then you can read the PBCH. And the PBCH, it's a number of bits. It's not that many bits. See them in the list here. I don't remember if I add them up together what you get, but you can do the math yourself. So they are polar coded together and scrambled, and the scrambling is kind of linked to the cell identity you found. So there's no risk that you read the PBCH of another cell. So then you can read the PBCH, and then you get some timing information, SSB time index. Remember, if you go back to this figure, that you don't know which of these PBCHs you have detected. So it could be this one. So then you need to know where in this SS burst this PBCH is. Is this the first one, or is it the fourth one, or something else? So that information you get out of this time index field and in the half frame bits. And then you get some more information. Some of these bits are hidden in the scrambling sequence. Well, you get the cell barred. You can borrow a cell. That basically means that yes, this is a cell, but you're not allowed to camp on it. That can be used, for example, for testing a cell. You just want to set it up and see that it runs without having any UAs accessing it. Or it can be used for this non-standalone deployment. if you know that the U is accessing NR via LT, then you don't want it to access NR directly. So then you can borrow the NR cell in the PBCH. And then there's some other information here as well that has to do with what is the DMRS configuration, so that you know how to find that. System frame number is basically a time indicator that wraps around roughly every 10 seconds. That's used in some control settings. And you know this CB grid offset and things like that. So you get some very, very basic information about the cell now. You don't know much, but you know a little bit. And what you know is enough in order to figure out where CORESET 0 is, control resource at 0. But that's linked to the PBCH. You know where that is. So once you have detected the PBCH, you start to monitor for PDCCHs in CORESET 0. And that configuration of that PDCCH that you have in the MIB as well. So you know a little bit how to monitor for this PDCCH, what aggregation levels and so on you have. So once you have the MIB, you know the frame timing, you know where all the resource blocks are located, you know the CORESET 0 and DMRS and some other stuff. And you also know your initial downlink bandwidth part, because that is the same size of CORESET 0. And then you start to monitor the PDCCH. If you find the PDCCH with an RNTI indicating that this is system information, then you read the data channel. And in the data channel, you get what's known as a SIB1, System Information Block 1, which contains more information about how the cell is configured.
Excuse me.
Yep.
So now, when we roll back a bit, we had this millimeter wave system where we have 64 beams, and they were transmitted in 64 different directions. The same primary synchronization signal and the secondary synchronization signal.
Yes.
The same system information in all these different beam directions.
Almost. This SSB time index is different in different directions.
Okay.
Because these would be the different directions.
Yeah.
You find one of them, then you want to know where is the beginning of the SS burst. So then here you transmit index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, and so on.
Okay.
Then you know what difference between the different beams, this index here. But the rest of the stuff is the same.
Okay. So the system frame number is like this the whole 10 millisecond, it has the same system frame number. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It basically counts the number of 10 millisecond frames.
But there is no beam ID or something like that.
Not really. I mean, you could in some sense say you have an SSB time index, so you know which SSB you detected, and that is in some sense some kind of beam identity.
Okay. And
we will see that this is used indirectly a little bit later on when you do random access. So
okay.
You can think of this as some kind of beam ID, yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's wait for random access. Yes.
Okay, well, when you read the MIB, you know how to monitor for PDCCH, and once you found the PDCCH with the SIBs, you can receive SIB1, which contains system information. And once you have received SIB1, then you know something about the cell, and then you can actually receive the rest of the SIB, SIB2 and upwards, that contains even more configuration and information that you may or may not be interested in. And the other SIBs, they could either be periodically transmitted, or you could actually do a special random access and request information about the other SIBs. So that can be used in a cell. If you want to have a very lean cell, the only thing you need to transmit is the SSBs and SIB1. And SIB1 comes that's scheduled by PDCCH at some regular time intervals. Everything else could be on demand. So when you get into that cell, it could ask the system, hey, I would like to know the SIB2 and upwards. And then the system transmits the other SIBs as well. So you can have a very, very lean setup that way. Okay, we talked about CORESET 0 that you get from this MIB, and that's based on 8-bit field, so you can have 256 different configurations that are tabulated in a long table, and the MIB tells you which one to use. And then you have the initial downlink bandwidth part. So that's equal to the CORESET 0 unless you later on get another value in say 1. And you can transmit these SSBs in CORESET 0 and C1 will be in a PDSH in some different patterns here. So there are different multiplexing patterns defined. That's a little bit the thinking behind some of the entries in these tables. So this would be a good pattern if you have not too much bandwidth. You have a relatively narrow channel and you want to time multiplex them. That could be useful in lower frequency band, for example. And if the beamforming here, of course, you need to beamform SSB in the same direction as this one. So that you find this one, and then later on in the cycle, you get back and 20 milliseconds later, read it again, then you can read SSB. If you have more frequency domain, then you can speed up the process a little bit by putting the SSB next to the CORESET 0 and the MIB multiplexing the time domain. Then in the more frequency, more bandwidth, so typically more in millimeter wave. On the other hand, it will be quicker because you find it quicker once you found the MIB the first time you also read the SSB, which makes sense if you have a large number of beams, which you typically have up in these frequency ranges where you have more bandwidth. So that's a little bit behind the background thinking if you would dig into all these different configurations and try to understand why they are the way they are. Okay, I think I said this, that MIB and read SIB, and SIB actually contains everything you need to know to do random access. So in principle, you can do random access and request the other SIBs. Or if you have a deployment where you know there will quite often be new UEs coming all the time, you may decide to periodically transmit the other SIBs as well. That's a choice you have in the deployment. Now we get to random access. And we'll see a little bit how we can do this beamforming thing in random access. The random access, it's a 4-step random access procedure. So it starts by the device transmitting a preamble. The network receives the preamble, responds with the random access response. The device does something with that and transmits a message 3 in the uplink, and the network responds with message 4. The last two is for content resolution. And then once this is done, you have established a connection with the system, and you can configure to ask about what capabilities the UE has and if there's some more configuration you need to do, and then you can do the data transmission. So the thinking, the reason why we do this 4-step thing is that when we do the preamble transmission, we have no clue about the uplink timing. We don't know anything about it. So we need to have some guard here to be on the safe side, not to drift into other transmissions from already existing scheduled users and so on. So this is a relatively inefficient transmission in that respect. So we don't want to have a large payload there, transmit a lot of data. We just want to transmit a short sequence, detect that one, respond with information that allows the device to adjust the uplink timing. And once we have done that, then we can transmit message 3 and 4 using the regular data channel and do that in a more efficient way and time align and so on. So that's why we do this 4-step procedure. There is actually a possibility in release 16, also a possibility for 2-step random access where we combine the preamble and message 3 into one message and the random access response and message 4 into one message. That will result in a little bit quicker random access procedure, but it's mainly useful in smaller cells, I would say, where the cost of having the timing uncertainty here may not be as big. So that's a possibility you have in later ML releases. So, and why do we do random access? Yeah, I think an obvious answer is, of course, initial access. I bought a new phone and I turn it on. I want to access the network. It could also be a handover. I'm running in one cell, I move around, so I get an instruction from the network to do handover to a neighboring cell because I get into that area. Then I need to establish uplink synchronization to that cell, and for that reason I can use random access. It could be to request system information. Maybe I have a system that is kind of lean, so it doesn't broadcast all the system information. I need to request that one. It could be that I lost uplink synchronization for some reason. Maybe I haven't received a downlink transmission for quite some time, so the timer started to drift. And I get the downlink data transmission. Then I need to reestablish uplink sync as well in order to send ACNACs and so on. And there could be other reasons as well. So this is not an exhaustive list, it's just 4 examples. Let's see how we do random access then. We start with this first preamble. As I said, that preamble, the timing is unknown here. I need to have quite a bit of guard. So if I, let's say I set aside 1 millisecond for preamble reception here and preamble transmission, then the preamble can't be 1 millisecond. It needs to be something less. Maybe 800 micro or something to allow for sufficient guard time here, because if the U is close to the base station, it would end up here. If it's far away, it will come late in time, and I don't want it to interfere with the other ongoing uplink transmissions. So these preambles, they can be transmitted in random access slots. So I have a number of RATCH slots that occur every now and then in time domain. And when they occur, that's part of the SID1 configurations. I receive that information from the network that these are the random access slots where you're allowed to do preamble transmissions. And then I had that on a hidden slide, maybe I shouldn't have hidden it, but the preamble is basically a random sequence. So in each cell there are 64 different random sequences. And in the neighboring cell there are another set of 64 random sequences. So you trying to do an initial access, that picks one of these preambles at random, tosses a coin, picks a preamble and transmits that in one of the RATCH slots. And depending on the configuration of the system, there's a long number of different preambles you can set up. The format 0 to 3, they're basically inherited from LTE, so they're the same one as we have in LTE. And you can see you can have a preamble that is more than 3 milliseconds long. It's a very long preamble. And the purpose of that is, of course, to handle very, very large cells where I need to do, for link budget reasons, I need to have a lot of energy to be received strong enough in the base station. So then I have a long preamble. Then I also need to reserve quite a bit of guard time in that RATCH window to make sure that I don't adapt wrong. And we have some other not as long formats as well. And then we also have a number of shorter preambles that are used in the higher frequency bands and for smaller cells that have different properties. And which of these to use, they are provided to the U by configuration of the system information. So the U knows which preamble to pick. So the user, the device, picks a random preamble, transmits that to the network in the RATCH slot. The network sees that someone's trying to do random access. It doesn't have a clue about who it is. It just knows there's someone trying to access the network. But it knows which sequence it is, and it can estimate the timing of that sequence. So it does some computation and figure out that, okay, with this timing that I measured and received, I need to correct the timing of that UE. So I send back a timing advance command and a scheduling grant from SL3, a normal scheduling grant telling the device or the UE about which uplink resources to use from SH3. And I also give the UE a temporary identity. temporary cell radio network temporary identity, TCR. I get this temporary identity here. But at this point, after message 2, after getting the random access response, it could still be so that 2 different UEs picked the same preamble sequence and did random access at the same time. Of course, if they are pick different preamble sequences, then I can differentiate them and I can send different random access responses. But if they pick the same, I don't know that. I just saw something. Both of these devices would see the same random access response. Both of them would think that, hey, I got a grant here. And both of them would start to transmit message 3 in the uplink using these resources they got in the scheduler grant from in the RAR. So what they do in this message 3, they transmit a message including their identity. And if it's a cold start, then it includes its a core network identity. I think it's 48-bit. It's the IMSI or TIMSI or whatever it's called. It was IMSI in LT. It's called something else in NR. But it's basically an identity from the SIM card, so you know who it is. And or if it already had the CRNTI, it was already known in the cell, then it can transmit the CRNTI instead. And then the network receives that here. And then the network can see which of these, if there was multiple colliding UEs, which of the identities did I receive here? And then it can respond back with that same identity. And then the device is here. If I receive the same identity here as I transmitted here, then everything is fine. It was for me. But if I receive something else than what I transmitted here as identity, okay, then someone else won this contention. There was some other UE doing random access at the same time, and that device won. So then I had to go back and start all over again. And if this identity you send up in message is a core network identity, then the base station can contact the core network to see is this a valid subscriber, and etc., and get back some information and before it responds to message 4. And then you probably also want to know what power should I use for my preamble. Should I use a lot of power or modest power? And that you estimate from the downlink. You measure the received signal strength in the downlink and compute the open loop estimate of the path loss. And from that, you figure out what power to use in your preamble. And you use that here. And if you lose these contentions, you have to restart again. Or if you don't, or especially if you don't get a raw random access response here after preamble transmission within a certain time window, then you bump up your power and transmit the preambling again until you get this random access response. And they know you know that the network heard you. Yeah, that's a gradual ramping of the power. So that's the general procedure behind random access.
So now, if we get back to this millimeter wave system with the 64 directions, right?
Yes.
And we assume then that the base station is based on analog beamforming, and we don't, and it means that it really like then there is these directions that it is transmitting to or listening to at any given time. So how do we now guarantee that if there is this UE kind of finds the beam number 5 or perhaps beam number 6, but none of the other beams? So how do we now guarantee that this random access is done at the moment when the base station listens to beam number 5 or beam number 6?
Exactly, and that's a very good question, and that is what I hopefully have on this slide. I transmit my SSBs sweeping through all the different beams. And the UE listens, and in this case, it heard SSB number 4, or in beam number 4. Good. Then we have created a linkage between which SSB you hear the strongest, in this case SSB4, and which RAT slot to use.
Okay.
But there's a dependency between those two specified, which means that if the network transmits SSB4 in this direction using analog beamforming, at a certain point later in time, it should listen in that same direction, because then is when UE that received SSB4 will do random access.
And from then the implicit understanding is coming to the base station in some sense about the direction of the UV.
Yeah, of course, that gives you a little bit of an idea of the direction. So if I transmit to my SSB in one direction, then it's likely that the UV, I mean, since the channel is reciprocal, the RATCH attempt will be strong in that direction as well. So the UV, I will hear the UV in that direction. But if you have digital beamforming, which you can have, at least on low frequency, then you're free to listen on all directions at the same time.
Yeah.
And if you have digital beamforming, you can, of course, transmit. You don't have to do this beam sweeping thing. You can transmit SSBs at the same time as well. So, but it's done such that you can do the analog beam sweeping, which you typically need to do at least to some extent in the higher frequencies. But the answer to your question is that you have a linkage between the SSB transmission instant and when the corresponding RATCH occasion occurs.
So, but if you have, so you said that if the base station now has digital beamforming, so would then the normal assumption be that the base station would transmit simultaneously as many of these blocks to different directions as it has the digital RF chains, like up to the number of antennas, different directions simultaneously?
Yeah, that you could do in that case. That could be beneficial because then maybe you can shut down your base station a little bit sooner until the next 20 millisecond period.
But isn't it now, in some sense, let's say that because part of the gain from beamforming comes, or actually all of the gain from beamforming comes from the fact that you are directing power to a direction. And now, if you then simultaneously transmit to multiple directions, then you are reducing the amount of power that you can get to one. So somehow the cell is smaller if you transmit multiple simultaneously. So is it then sound that this is something that is left to your implementation, which you don't tell us, but we can make hypothesis? We would make a hypothesis.
It's an implementation thing that you can do whatever you want in that sense. But you're right, of course. I mean, if I transmit all directions at the same time, I have less power in each direction typically, which kind of offsets the whole point. So it's a little bit, I mean, either you can extend the transmission in time to gather enough energy, or you can do beamforming and sweep through the beams, and then the net result will be the same thing. So that's true, as I said. I mean, if you don't beamform, if you have a wider beam or do more an omni thing, then you get less energy because you don't focus as much. But in some deployment, maybe that could be still be okay.
But somehow, let's say that then the principal hypothesis that we would make would be that okay, whatever the network is doing, it is doing the let's say the synchronization signal transmission in such a way that the coverage of those is slightly or about the same as the coverage of the shared channel transmissions.
Yeah, I mean, because if you don't receive the sync signals, you can't see the cell. So then it basically puts an upper bound on the coverage.
But in some sense, you would like it to be a bit larger than the shared channel coverage.
Yeah, exactly. The sync signals are designed such that you can detect them down to signal to interference ratio, I think it's around -8 dB or something like that. So they actually go a little bit into the neighboring cell. And the reason for that is to be able to detect a new cell and prepare for a handover before you have come too far out in the old cell. So they actually have, in that sense, better coverage than the data channel.
Okay, thank you.
So that was beamforming and random access. I think this was probably the last slide. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So I thought maybe I should say something on mobility as well. And this is a slide I picked from some very overviewish presentation I held once. So it's less detailed. But I mean, obviously, mobility is a cornerstone. So what we do in mobility is that the handset or the UV regularly performs cell search to find better cells. So it tries to find this PSS, SSS all the time. And if it's a connected state mobility, if I see, you know, I'm in this cell, I hear the PSS, SSS from the neighboring cell, and if it's strong enough, then I can report back to the network that, hey, I heard this other cell with this signal strength. And then the network can take a decision whether to do a handover or not. If I'm in idle or inactive state, then it's up to me as a handset to take that decision. Then I hear another cell, and when that is strong enough, I do basically camp on that one instead. Which means that in idle and inactive state, you don't know in which cell the U is. You know it on a larger scale, a tracking area, which is a collection of several cells, but you don't know which cell it is. But if you do active state mobility, then you know exactly in which cell you're in. Then you can, of course, also have mobility within the cell. If I'm running around like this within the cell, that's also some form of mobility, but that I handle with beam refinement and moving the beams. So I can switch from one beam to another beam and things like that. So that is handled on the physical layer, no need to involve the higher layers. But if I do mobility to a different cell, then I have to do to random access to synchronize to this uplink and so on. And it involves some higher layer signaling to move to that cell. And just to give you a little bit of feeling for this is mobility in connected state, all the messages going back and forth. I search for candidate cells. So I'm here, I get some measurement control, I do some communication. At some point I noticed that I found another cell that sounds better. So I do scheduling request, I ask the network the base station to get some resources to send my uplink. Get them down uplink allocation, I send a measurement report. The base station takes a decision, yes, it's probably a good idea to do handover, so it contacts the neighboring base station or the XN interface and ask that base station, can you take over this UV? The target cell responds back that yes, it's okay, I can do that, or says no, I cannot. And you send some downlink scheduling to the UV with some reconfiguration, telling the UV to reconfigure to this new cell and to disconnect from the old one. It has to do synchronization, random access to sync to a new cell. In the meantime, the old base station may have some data packets that has not been delivered yet. So it forwards those to the target cell that buffers those packets, get random access from the UV, go through this procedure we talked about. And in this case, you typically do random access with a dedicated preamble. So you basically tell the UV that do random access with this preamble, and this target cell knows that no one else it's a kind of couple of reserved preambles, knows that no one else will use this preamble at this point in time. So you will not have any contention to speed up things. And then you establish the connection here with the new cell, and then you can continue to do packet data here. And at some point, maybe you also need to do some things in the core network, which packet should go down to what base station. So there could be some signaling going on in the network side there that the user is not aware about, so to route the data to the right cell. And at some point, you can release that you completed from the source node B. So see, there's quite a lot of things going on when you do mobility to a new cell in the network side. So I won't go through all these messages. You can dig into them if you're interested. I don't know them by heart myself, but a lot of things going on with reconfiguration and things. And most of these higher layer, the blue arrows, layer 3 signal, there are messages going on the normal, using the normal downlink shared data channels. It's from a scheduling perspective, it's exactly as we talked about it so far. Nothing special. Yeah. Slide. And also the last session. I hope you're still awake. I know tons of information in a very short amount of time. It's really a crash course, so it's probably overheating in your brains pretty quickly. And I don't expect that you remember everything, but hopefully get a little bit of flavor of what's going on, and you can go back to the slides and dig into details you want. And there's some nice literature to read as well, or drop me an email if you have some particular question. I'll try to answer that.
No, I have a question related to the previous slide.
Yeah.
So now, at some stage, you were talking about the RRC idle state, connected state, and RRC idle. What was it?
Inactive.
Inactive.
Yeah, RRC inactive state. And now, if the RRC inactive state UE wants to move to the connected state and start to communicate, is then there a normal random access involved, or perhaps a random access of the type with the dedicated?
Then you do a random access. I mean, if you're in active state, then you need to do a random access to tell the network that you want to move. So you pick a preamble, and you have to do that typically at random. At least typically you don't have an assigned preamble. So you do that, you get a random access response, and since you already have an identity in that cell, if you're in the same cell, then you respond with that identity here. But then the network knows here, okay, this was a UI I already know about, so it's configured, it has everything in place, and so on. If you're not known in the system, then you use this core network identity, and then you need to establish all the configuration as well.
So is it then that this message 3 is shorter somehow? And
yeah, it can be of a different content and less information and so on, depending on what it is. So message 3 is relatively short for coverage reason in general, but depending on which state the device is in here, there could be more or less of that message 3 information that is filled in and makes sense.
But there is the same risk of collision basically as for a normal random access.
Yeah, it could be so, unless you for some reason have a dedicated preamble. I'm a little bit uncertain, to be honest, whether you can have a dedicated preamble in inactive state. I would guess typically not. But if there is such a possibility, I don't know. I need to check that. But typically you run through the same contention as anyone else. But the benefit with inactive state is that the network already know who you are. You have all the configuration about MIMO modes, whatever it could be. It's already set up and so on. So you don't need to do all that stuff. So you can immediately go up and start to transmit data, and security mechanisms are in place and so on.
And if it's a static UE, then it would also know its timing advance? Right?
Yeah, of course it can drift a little bit, but then I guess if it's already in sync here, then this random access response will come back with timing advance 0 because you're already fine. But the timing advance, as long as you're in connected mode and you're scheduled in the uplink, whenever you transmit some data in the uplink, there is you start a timer, and when that timer expires, you're considered to be out of sync in the uplink, and you need to reestablish the timing advance. Whenever you send data or get a new timing advance command, then you reset that timer, and when it expires, then you're out of sync, and you need to reestablish it when needed.
And how long is that time then?
Half a second or something like that. I mean, the timing advance commands come maybe once or twice per second or something like that. I mean, the typical answer for all these kind of things in 3PP, you can say it's configurable because pretty much everything is configurable. But something in that range, I would say, is a typical value.
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, I have a question. If we consider dual connectivity, and so the primary cell and the secondary cell will still need to maintain 2 RRC states, and so if we consider dual connectivity, currently the standard will standard define some power saving mechanism to save power, or it seems will consume double power. compared with no dual connectivity?
Yeah, I think so. I guess the question was to save power when you're in dual connectivity. Was that correctly understood, or?
Yeah.
I mean that if you do dual connectivity, the two legs are pretty much independent. I don't think you can be in idle mode on one and connected on the other. But other than that, I mean, scheduling is separate. You may timing advance is separate for the two. If you happen to do dual connectivity also in the uplink, you need to do random access independent on the two legs and so on. So they're pretty much treated as two completely independent legs. And then you can, of course, to save power, you can have your DRX mechanism and so on. And I mean, what you could do is to, in many cases, is made enough to just camp on one or on the master cell, so to say.
Okay.
And if you when you go back to idle mode, then the kind of dual connectivity disappears, and then you're just camping on one cell. So if you run non-standalone with dual connectivity between LTE and NR, and you switch back to idle mode, then you're in idle mode in the LTE sense and camping on the LTE cell. And once you want to use NR again, then you have to reactivate everything.
Stefan, where can we find your email if you want to have further discussion?
Okay. Maybe that's not present. I can put it somewhere here. I don't know. Do like this. It's very easy. It's just the first name dot last name. .com.
Okay. Yeah.
That should be easy to figure out, I guess.
Very innovative. Thanks.
Any more thoughts, or did you find it useful?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope so, and I hope that it was the right level as well. I mean, you probably know basic comm theory, but may not know all the details in the standard. So
Yes.
I guess no one does.
Yeah.
And then, if I remember correctly, there will be a session, a half-day session on Thursday as well with Antti et al. From Nokia. I guess
Yeah.
that's.
I think it's Harry Holmaus who is coming
Okay.
here.
Yes, Harry, that's coming, and he will probably talk a little bit more general about NR and a little bit of higher layer stuff. I would guess so. It will probably be a nice complement to what I said. At least that's the intention.
We all believe so.
Yeah.
Yes. But maybe more questions, Stefan? No? No? Mate wants to keep his questions for himself.
Actually, it's a follow-up question. I mean, it's all been for me, but I maybe need the reference. So I think email is better for this.
Okay.
I just want to have one last question. Curiosity about the current implementation of the 5G. Do we really use the software-defined radio in a proper way? I mean, like the full stack for the idea of slicing and all. I mean, is there in the current implementation two operators using the same infrastructure, hardware infrastructure?
Yeah, it's probably multiple questions. I mean, first, I'm not an implementation guy, so the short answer is I have no clue. But I know a little bit. I think the slicing thing, I think you do find the slicing on the core network side in products. To what extent it's used, I'm not sure, but it is there. And when it comes to what you call software-defined radio, that's of course a very term that you can stretch in different directions depending on what you want to say. But the core network more or less runs on fairly generic hardware nowadays. In the old days, if you go back 10 years, it was special boxes doing the core network stuff. Now it's fairly generic compute hardware, more like a cloud type of thing. The RAN side, the baseband, that typically run, at least the lower parts of the RAN runs on ASICs, special designed ASICs that does the decoding and the demodulation and so on. The higher layers of the RAN, you can run them on these more specific processing platforms, or you can actually, we do sell also cloud RAN products where you run most of the RAN on generic hardware platform, generic compute platform, x86 type of things. So you can actually choose which type of product you want. But the very low layers, when it comes down to FFTs and then that analog beamforming type of thing, that is done on ASICs, because that you can't really put the antenna in the cloud. That needs to be physical hardware. But fairly soon about that, you can start to cloudify things if you want to. And I think the trend is going in that direction.
Thank you.
Custom-made ASICs are often more power efficient and can give a little bit higher performance than if you do it on generic hardware. So there's a little bit of trade-off depending what you have. And what we typically do if you buy base stations, they are nowadays typically multi-standard. So the radio covers, at least in the bands that are similar or the same, cover both LTE and NR. So it's the same radio for both of them. And the base station box, the basic card that you buy sits in a box. That can run software both for NR and LTE at the same time as well. So then you just download whatever software is appropriate for your deployment.
Good. Thanks.
More questions? So if there are not more questions, let us thank Stefan for this.
Thanks for listening and bearing with me the whole day. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I usually do this in 4 sessions, 2 hours each in separate days when I've done similar things internally. So now I condensed it a bit and put everything in one day. So it's a crash course.
Yes. Yeah, it has been a serious package. Yeah.
And there's no written exam, so it's up to you what you want to remember. Okay, thank you. Have a nice weekend, not weekend, nice evening.